My father, Colonel Reginald Ashworth, tried to have me detained by campus security at my own college graduation ceremony, claiming I was disrespecting the family honor by wearing my dress uniform underneath my cap and gown. But when his own sergeant stepped forward and saluted me with, "Colonel, your orders, ma'am," the look on his face was worth every sleepless night I'd spent earning those eagles in secret. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When I was 16 and mentioned wanting to apply to the prestigious Thornfield Military Academy, Dad laughed and said, "Sweetheart, that's not for girls like you. Why don't you focus on something more appropriate?" When I was 18 and secretly took the academy entrance exams anyway, scoring in the top 5%, he found the acceptance letter before I did and threw it away, telling me later that real military families don't need their daughters playing soldier. When I was 20 and tried to bring up my interest in military service during a family dinner, he cut me off mid-sentence and announced to everyone present, "Jasmine has always had these little fantasies, but thankfully she'll outgrow them once she finds a nice husband and settles down." The pattern was always the same. Any dream I expressed, any ambition I voiced, any path I wanted to explore that didn't fit his narrow vision of what his daughter should be, shut down, dismissed, redirected towards something he deemed more suitable. Teaching elementary school, maybe nursing, perhaps marrying young to one of his fellow officers' sons. Something quiet, something that wouldn't compete with his legacy, something that would keep me firmly in his shadow. My mother, Lydia, had learned long ago not to interfere. She'd given up her own dreams of being a veterinarian when she married Dad, trading them for the role of perfect military wife. I watched her shrink herself year after year, nodding along with his pronouncements, never challenging his authority, never defending my aspirations. The few times I tried to get her support, she'd give me that sad smile and say, "Your father knows what's best, darling. He's only trying to protect you." Protect me from what? From success? From proving that I was just as capable as any son he never had? The breaking point should have come during my senior year of high school when he literally tore up my application to the Naval Academy right in front of me. Or maybe it should have been when I was 19 and he found out I'd been secretly taking military history courses at the local community college, and he called the dean to have me dropped from the program, claiming I was mentally unstable. Or perhaps it was when I turned 21 and he intercepted my mail to make sure I wasn't getting any foolish ideas about alternative career paths. But somehow, each time, I found myself backing down, apologizing, trying to prove I was still the obedient daughter he wanted me to be. Because that's what you do when you've been conditioned from birth to believe that disappointing your father is the worst possible sin you can commit. That's what happens when you've been raised to think that his approval is the most important thing in the world, and without it, you're nothing. I remember being 22, sitting in the campus counseling center, finally working up the courage to talk to someone about my family situation. The counselor, a kind woman named Dr. Pemberton, asked me a question that haunted me for months. "Jasmine, when you imagine your ideal life, your dream career, your perfect future, is your father anywhere in that picture cheering you on? Or is he always the obstacle you have to overcome?" I couldn't answer her then. The truth was too painful to admit. But I knew, deep down, I knew that every dream I'd ever had involved proving him wrong, showing him that I was capable of more than his limited imagination could grasp. Every goal I'd ever set was really about earning the respect he'd never freely given. And every time I backed down, every time I let him redirect my path, a little piece of my soul died. The worst part wasn't even his active sabotage of my plans. It was the casual dismissal, the way he'd changed the subject whenever I accomplished something he didn't value. When I graduated summa cum laude from Ravencroft University with a double major in international relations and strategy, he spent exactly 30 seconds congratulating me before launching into a story about one of his own college achievements. When I was accepted into the graduate program at Westmount Institute, one of the most competitive strategic studies programs in the country, he asked when I planned to get serious about my future. My younger brother Cameron, meanwhile, could do no wrong. When he barely scraped through his freshman year at a mediocre college, Dad praised his character-building experience. When Cameron dropped out entirely to find himself through a series of failed business ventures, Dad called it entrepreneurial spirit.
The double standard was so glaring that even our extended family started to notice, though no one ever called him on it.
I used to lie awake at night wondering what I'd done to deserve such different treatment. Was it simply because I was born female? Was it because I reminded him too much of his own father, who'd apparently been a demanding perfectionist? Or was it something deeper? A fear that if I succeeded in the military world he'd claimed as his own, it would somehow diminish his own accomplishments. Whatever the reason, by my 24th birthday, I developed what I now recognize as a toxic coping mechanism. I'd become addicted to trying to win his approval, even when I knew it was impossible. I'd present my achievements in the most unthreatening way possible, hoping that maybe this time he'd see my potential. I'd downplay my successes and emphasize how much I still needed his guidance. I'd even sabotage my own opportunities if I sensed they made him uncomfortable. Looking back, I can see how perfectly I'd been trained to be complicit in my own limitation. How expertly he'd conditioned me to believe that his comfort was more important than my growth, that his ego was more fragile than my dreams were powerful. But on that sunny May morning, as I walked across the campus of Ravencroft University toward what should have been one of the proudest moments of my life, I had no idea that everything was about to change. I had no idea that the secret I'd been keeping for the past 6 years was about to explode into the open in the most dramatic way possible. All I knew was that I was tired of being small, tired of hiding, tired of pretending that his approval was worth more than my own self-respect. What I didn't know was that sometimes the universe has a way of forcing confrontations we're too scared to initiate ourselves. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning of my college graduation, I was supposed to feel that familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach, the same one I'd carried to every milestone event where Dad would inevitably find something to criticize or control. I was supposed to be checking my phone every 5 minutes, hoping for some sign of his approval, dreading the moment he'd point out everything I was doing wrong. Instead, I found myself standing in front of my dorm room mirror at 6 a.m., carefully adjusting the dress uniform I'd hidden in the back of my closet for months, and for the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about him at all. The uniform fit perfectly. 6 years of secret training, weekend warrior sessions, and summer internships that were actually intensive military programs had transformed not just my body, but my entire sense of self. The woman staring back at me wasn't the uncertain, approval-seeking daughter who'd spent decades trying to shrink herself small enough to fit into her father's narrow expectations. This was Colonel Jasmine Ashworth of the Army Reserve, and she had earned every single ribbon on her chest. My roommate Natasha knocked softly on the door. "Jazz, you decent? I brought coffee and those blueberry muffins from the campus cafe you love." "Come in," I called, still admiring how the uniform transformed my entire posture. I stood straighter, shoulders back, chin lifted with quiet confidence. Natasha walked in carrying a steaming cup and a paper bag, took one look at me, and nearly dropped both. "Holy shit, Jazz! Wow, you look like you could command an army." I laughed, accepting the coffee gratefully. "That's kind of the point." "Are you really going to wear that under your graduation gown? What if your dad sees it?" For months, that question would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I would have changed clothes immediately, choosing something safe and unremarkable, something that wouldn't risk his displeasure. I would have spent the entire ceremony focused on his facial expressions, reading his mood, adjusting my behavior to keep his approval. But this morning, something was different. Maybe it was the way the uniform made me feel, like I finally looked on the outside the way I'd always felt on the inside. Maybe it was the knowledge that in just a few hours, I'd be graduating summa cum laude while secretly holding the rank of full colonel at age 24, making me one of the youngest field-grade officers in Army Reserve history. Maybe it was simply that I was tired. Tired of being small, tired of hiding,
tired of pretending that his approval was worth more than my own self-respect. What I didn't know was that sometimes the universe has a way of forcing confrontations we're too scared to initiate ourselves.
For 6 years, I'd been building a parallel life, one that Dad knew nothing about. Every weekend, I told him I was studying or spending time with friends. I'd actually been at Fort Meridian, 3 hours away, working my way up through the ranks faster than anyone thought possible. Every summer internship I'd mentioned was actually advanced military training, leadership schools, strategy seminars with some of the brightest military minds in the country. I'd started as a naive 21-year-old private, convinced I'd never be good enough to prove my father wrong. But something magical had happened in that environment where my gender didn't matter, where my father's name carried no weight, where I was judged solely on my performance, my leadership ability, and my strategic thinking. I'd excelled beyond my wildest dreams. My commanding officers didn't see Reginald Ashworth's daughter trying to play soldier. They saw a natural leader with an intuitive grasp of complex military strategy, someone who could inspire trust in her subordinates and respect from her superiors. They saw potential where my father had seen only inconvenience. Within 2 years, I'd been fast-tracked for officer training. Within 4 years, I'd been promoted to captain ahead of schedule. Last year, at 23, I'd become the youngest lieutenant colonel in my unit's history. And just 6 months ago, after leading a training exercise that impressed a visiting Pentagon delegation, I'd been promoted again. Colonel, at 24 years old, while my father still saw me as his little girl who needed protection from her own unrealistic dreams. The irony was delicious, even if I was the only one who could taste it. "Earth to Jasmine," Natasha said, waving her hand in front of my face. "You've been staring at yourself in that mirror with the weirdest smile for like 5 minutes. Are you having some kind of breakdown?" "Actually," I said, turning away from the mirror and sitting down to pull on my dress shoes, "I think I might be having the opposite of a breakdown. I think I might be finally putting myself back together." For the first time in years, I wasn't spending the hours before a major family event obsessing over my father's potential reactions. I wasn't rehearsing conversations or preparing emotional shields or trying to anticipate his criticisms. Instead, I was thinking about my own achievements, my own pride, my own future. I was thinking about the deployment letter in my drawer and whether I was finally ready to say yes. I was thinking about how good it felt to wear a uniform I'd earned through 6 years of dedication, sacrifice, and excellence that had nothing to do with anyone's expectations but my own. Most surprisingly of all, I was thinking about how much I was looking forward to walking across that stage today. Not because it might finally earn my father's approval, but because I was genuinely proud of what I'd accomplished, both publicly and in secret. As I laced up my dress shoes, I caught myself humming. Actually humming. When was the last time I'd been happy on the morning of a family event? "You know what, Tash?" I said, standing up and adjusting my gown over the uniform one final time. "I think today is going to be a very good day." And for the first time in 24 years, I meant it. The graduation ceremony was scheduled to begin at 2 p.m., but Dad called my cell phone at exactly 11:47 a.m. I know the precise time because I was sitting on campus coffee shop, calmly reviewing my valedictorian speech one final time when his name flashed across my screen. For a split second, that old familiar dread tried to creep up my spine, the automatic response pattern that had been ingrained in me for over 2 decades. Dad calls, heart rate spikes, immediate shift into damage control mode, prepare to apologize for something I haven't done yet. But instead, I found myself staring at his name on the screen with something approaching curiosity. When was the last time I'd answered one of his calls without that churning anxiety in my stomach? "Hi, Dad," I answered, genuinely surprised by how normal my voice sounded. "Jasmine." His tone was already clipped, already carrying that edge of disapproval I knew so well. "I just spoke with Dean Morrison. He mentioned you're giving some kind of speech today. Since when do you make major commitments without discussing them with your family first?" The old Jasmine would have immediately apologized, would have downplayed the honor, would have found some way to make it seem smaller than it was. She would have said something like, "Oh, it's not that big a deal, Dad. Just a short thing. I probably shouldn't have agreed to it." Instead, I heard myself saying, "I was selected as valedictorian, Dad. The speech comes with the territory." A pause. A long pause. In that silence,
I could practically hear him recalibrating, trying to figure out why his usual emotional control mechanisms weren't working. Valedictorian. His voice carried a strange mixture of surprise and something that might have been irritation. Since when? Your mother and I weren't informed about this development. Development. Like my academic success was some kind of unexpected medical condition that had befallen the family.
It was announced 3 weeks ago, I said, taking a sip of my latte and watching a group of graduating seniors take photos by the fountain outside. I sent you and Mama Demo about it. I don't recall receiving any such email. Of course he didn't. Just like he'd never received my acceptance letters, my award notifications, my scholarship announcements. Just like information about my achievements had a mysterious way of never quite reaching him, while every piece of criticism or concern somehow found its way to me immediately. Well, I continued, still amazed by my own calm tone. Either way, the ceremony starts at 2. I'll be speaking just before they confer degrees. You'll hear all about it then. Another pause. Longer this time. I could sense him struggling with something, could hear him taking one of those deep breaths he always took when he was preparing to deliver what he considered necessary guidance. Jasmine, sweetheart, I need you to think very carefully about this. Valedictorian speeches are, well, they're quite public, quite visible. And given your tendency toward, shall we say, overly ambitious statements in the past, I'm concerned you might say something that could reflect poorly on our family, on my career. There it was, the real concern. Not whether I deserved the honor, not pride in my achievement, but worry about how my success might somehow damage his reputation. What exactly are you worried I might say, Dad? It's not about any specific content, he said quickly. It's about appropriateness, about knowing your place, about not getting carried away with grand ideas that might embarrass us all later. Grand ideas, like wanting to serve my country, like believing I was capable of leadership, like thinking I deserved to be taken seriously. Dad, I said, and something in my voice must have been different because he went completely quiet. What if I told you that my grand ideas aren't actually that grand? What if I told you they're already reality? What are you talking about? For 6 years, I'd imagined this moment. For 6 years, I'd rehearsed different versions of this conversation in my head. Sometimes I'd fantasized about dramatic revelations, about throwing my achievements in his face, about watching him scramble to process the reality of who I'd become without his permission or guidance. But now, sitting in this coffee shop, wearing my carefully hidden uniform under my graduation gown, I found that I didn't want to be dramatic. I didn't want to hurt him or shock him or prove him wrong in some vindictive way. I just wanted to tell the truth. Dad, do you remember 6 years ago when you said real military families don't need their daughters playing soldier? Jasmine, what does that have to do with... Do you remember telling me that I should focus on something more appropriate than military service? His voice got very quiet. Where is this going? It's going toward the truth, Dad. The truth is that while you've been protecting me from my own ambitions, I've been living them. Every weekend for the past 6 years, every summer internship, every time you thought I was safely tucked away in some nice, appropriate activity. I could hear him breathing, could picture him in his study, probably standing behind his desk, probably staring at one of his commendation plaques, trying to process what I was telling him. What are you saying? I'm saying that your daughter, the one who supposedly needs protection from her own unrealistic dreams, is currently a full colonel in the Army Reserve. I'm saying that the woman you've been trying to redirect toward teaching or nursing has been commanding soldiers and designing military strategy for years. I'm saying that maybe, just maybe, I knew what I was talking about when I was 16 years old and told you I wanted to serve my country. The silence that followed was so complete, I thought the call might have dropped. That's impossible, he said finally. Is it? Or is it just impossible for you to believe? Jasmine, I don't know what kind of game you're playing. It's not a game, Dad. It's my life. The The life I built while you weren't looking. The life I built because you weren't looking. You're telling me that you've been lying to me for 6 years? And there it was. Not surprise at my achievements, not pride in my service, not amazement at what I'd accomplished despite his active discouragement, just accusation. Just the implication that I was somehow the problem for not allowing him to sabotage my dreams in real time. I'm telling you that I've been protecting my dreams from someone who spent 24 years trying to kill them. And the words came out so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that they shocked even me. Jasmine Marie Ashworth, I will not be spoken to like... Like what, Dad? Like someone who might not know what's best for me? Like someone who might not have my best interests at heart? Like someone who might be wrong? For the first time in my life, I'd interrupted him. For the first time in 24 years, I'd refused to let him finish a sentence designed to put me back in my place. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. "We'll discuss this after the ceremony," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger.
"Will we?" I asked. "Or will you spend the ceremony trying to figure out how to make this about you? How to turn my achievement into your embarrassment? How to make sure everyone knows that none of this was supposed to happen?" "I'll see you at 2 o'clock, Jasmine." "See you then, Dad." He hung up without saying goodbye, which was probably for the best. Because as I sat there, staring at my phone, I realized something that would have terrified the old me, but somehow filled the new me with a strange sense of peace. I had just told my father the truth about who I was, and the world hadn't ended. I had just refused to apologize for my success, and lightning hadn't struck me down. I had just set a boundary with the most intimidating person in my life, and somehow I was still breathing. More than that, I was excited about what would happen next. For the first time in my life, I was about to walk across a stage as exactly who I was, not who someone else thought I should be. And if that made him uncomfortable, if that challenged his assumptions, if that forced him to see me differently, well, maybe it was about time. I arrived at Thornfield Memorial Auditorium 90 minutes before the ceremony, ostensibly to rehearse my speech one final time, but really because I needed space to process what had just happened on the phone with Dad. The auditorium was nearly empty, except for a few maintenance workers adjusting sound equipment and volunteers arranging programs on chairs. Walking across the stage where I'd be delivering my address in less than 2 hours, I felt remarkably centered. 6 years of military discipline had taught me to compartmentalize, to focus on the mission at hand regardless of external pressures. But this wasn't just military training kicking in. This was something deeper. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't spending the hours before a major event trying to manage someone else's emotions. My phone buzzed. A text from Mom. "Your father told me about your conversation. We need to discuss your attitude before the ceremony. Meet us in the family reception area at 1:30. My attitude. Not my achievements, not my service record, not the fact that I'd managed to become a field-grade officer while maintaining a 4.0 GPA. My attitude. I typed back, "I'll be preparing for my speech until 1:45. See you at the ceremony." Another buzz, almost immediately. "Jasmine, this is not negotiable. Your father expects..." I turned my phone off. The old Jasmine would have been devastated by that exchange. She would have spent the next hour crafting the perfect apology, figuring out how to make herself smaller, how to reassure Dad that none of this military business meant she was getting too big for her britches. She would have arrived at that family meeting prepared to minimize her achievements and refocus attention on what really mattered, his comfort with the situation. Instead, I found myself walking to the campus bookstore, where I purchased a small American flag pin. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror, I carefully attached it to the lapel of my uniform, right above my ribbon rack. It was a tiny act of defiance, but it felt monumental. When I finally made my way to the family reception area at 1:50, 15 minutes later than Mom had demanded, I could see Dad from across the room before he spotted me.
He was dressed in his full dress uniform, his own chest decorated with ribbons and medals he'd earned over a distinguished 28-year career. He was talking animatedly with Dean Morrison, probably positioning himself as the proud military father whose daughter was following dutifully in his footsteps. Mom stood beside him in a navy blue dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, nodding at appropriate intervals, playing her familiar role as the supportive spouse who never questioned, never challenged, never stepped out of line. My younger brother Cameron lounged nearby in an ill-fitting suit, scrolling through his phone with the bored expression of someone who'd been dragged to yet another family obligation. At 22, he'd already dropped out of college twice and was currently finding himself through a series of failed get-rich-quick schemes that Dad somehow managed to frame as entrepreneurial exploration. When Dad spotted me approaching, his expression shifted immediately. I watched him excuse himself from his conversation with the dean and stride toward me with the purposeful walk I recognized as his preparation for battle march. Jasmine, his voice was low, controlled, designed not to attract attention from the other families milling around the reception area. We need to discuss your revelation from earlier today. What's to discuss? I asked, genuinely curious about how he planned to handle this. What's to discuss? His eyes narrowed. What's to discuss is that you have apparently been conducting some sort of secret military fantasy for the past 6 years, and now you seem to think that gives you license to speak to your father with disrespect. Military fantasy. Even now, even after I told him my rank, his instinct was to diminish what I had accomplished.
Dad, it's not a fantasy. I'm a colonel in the Army Reserve. I've been promoted 5 times in 6 years. I've commanded soldiers, designed training programs, briefed Pentagon officials. This is my career, not some elaborate game of dress-up. Mom appeared at Dad's elbow, her face carrying that familiar expression of concerned mediation. Sweetheart, perhaps we could discuss this after the ceremony. Today should be about celebrating your graduation. Mother, this is about her graduation, Dad said sharply. It's about the speech she's planning to give in front of 3,000 people, including my colleagues and superiors. It's about making sure she doesn't say anything inappropriate. Inappropriate like what? I asked. Like anything about this alleged military service. Like anything that might give people the impression that she's been leading some sort of double life behind her family's back. Alleged military service. The man who had built his entire identity around his military career was standing there calling my own service alleged. It's not alleged, Dad. It's documented, official, and recognized by the Department of Defense. Just because you weren't informed doesn't make it less real. His jaw tightened. What makes it less real is that no daughter of mine would enter military service without her father's knowledge and approval. What makes it less real is that military discipline and chain of command mean something, and part of that meaning is family consultation and respect for authority. And there it was, the heart of the matter. Not concern for my well-being, not worry about my choices, not even anger about being deceived. This was about authority. About the fact that I had succeeded in his world without his permission, without his guidance, without his control. So, let me understand this correctly, I said, my voice remaining remarkably steady. My actual service record, my actual rank, my actual achievements, none of that matters because I didn't ask your permission first? What matters is respect for family hierarchy and proper decision-making processes. And what if those processes had prevented me from becoming the person I was meant to be? Dad stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. What if I told you that this conversation ends right now, and when you walk across that stage in 20 minutes, you give a nice, appropriate speech about gratitude and humility and moving forward responsibly? What if I told you that any mention of military service, any suggestion that you've been anything other than a dedicated student, would be completely unacceptable? The old Jasmine would have caved immediately. The old Jasmine would have agreed to anything to avoid his disapproval, would have rewritten her speech in the bathroom, would have spent her valedictorian address minimizing herself to protect his ego.
But standing there in that reception area, feeling the weight of my uniform under my graduation gown, thinking about the deployment orders waiting in my dorm room, I found myself asking a question I'd never dared to ask before. And what if I told you no? The silence that followed was unlike any silence I'd ever experienced with my father. Mom actually took a step backward. Cameron looked up from his phone for the first time all day. Even the general chatter around us seemed to pause. "Excuse me?" Dad's voice was barely above a whisper. I said, "What if I told you no? What if I told you that I'm 24 years old, I've earned this honor through my own hard work, and I'm going to give the speech I plan to give? What if I told you that I'm proud of who I've become, including the parts of myself that I built without your approval?" His face was cycling through a range of expressions I'd never seen before. Shock, anger, disbelief, something that might have been fear. "If you mention your alleged military involvement in that speech, if you embarrass this family in front of my colleagues, there will be consequences, Jasmine. Serious consequences. Such as you can find somewhere else to live after graduation, such as you can pay for your own graduate school, such as you can build your fantasy military career without any support from this family." And there it was, the ultimatum. The nuclear option he had been holding in reserve for 24 years. The threat that had kept me in line through every previous conflict. Complete abandonment if I didn't conform to his expectations. The old Jasmine would have been devastated. The old Jasmine would have immediately backtracked, would have apologized profusely, would have done anything to avoid the terrifying prospect of losing her family's support. But standing there, looking at this man who was threatening to disown me for succeeding beyond his imagination, I realized something that changed everything. I didn't need his support anymore. I hadn't needed it for years. "Dad," I said quietly, "I love you, but I'm not going to shrink myself to make you comfortable anymore. I'm going to walk across that stage in 15 minutes, and I'm going to tell the truth about who I am and what I've accomplished. All of it. If that embarrasses you, maybe you should ask yourself why your daughter's success feels like your failure." I turned and walked toward the auditorium entrance, leaving him standing there with his ultimatum hanging in the air like smoke. For the first time in my life, I was about to choose myself over his approval. And it felt like flying.
As I walked away from my father's ultimatum and toward the auditorium where I would deliver the most important speech of my life, my mind began doing something it had never done before during a family crisis. Instead of frantically strategizing how to repair the damage I'd supposedly caused, I found myself thinking clearly about the damage that had been done to me. The 15-minute walk from the family reception area to the backstage entrance should have been filled with panic, with desperate attempts to figure out how to salvage the situation, how to apologize my way back into his good graces, how to make this all go away. Instead, I found myself taking a detour through the campus sculpture garden, where I'd spent countless hours over the past 4 years whenever I needed space to think. Sitting on the stone bench beside the memorial fountain dedicated to alumni who had died in military service, I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen. For 24 years, this would have been the moment I called him back, the moment I texted an apology, the moment I found some way to minimize the conflict and restore his comfort with the situation. But instead of opening my contacts, I found myself opening the photo gallery on my phone, scrolling through 6 years of images I'd never shared with my family. Pictures from Fort Meridian during my initial training, where I was barely recognizable as the uncertain 21-year-old who'd arrived, convinced she'd never be good enough. Photos from my first promotion ceremony, where I stood at attention as they pinned captain's bars on my uniform while a room full of superior officers applauded my leadership potential. There I was receiving my first commendation for excellence in strategic planning. There I was leading my first training exercise, surrounded by soldiers who looked to me for guidance and trusted my decisions.
There I was at the Pentagon briefing, the youngest person in a room full of colonels and generals, presenting a tactical analysis that would later be adopted as standard protocol. Every single image told the same story. This was a woman who belonged in uniform, who had found her calling, who had discovered exactly who she was meant to be when she stopped trying to be who someone else thought she should be. Why had I hidden this from them? Not just from Dad, but from everyone in my family. Why had I spent 6 years living two separate lives, keeping my greatest achievements secret, pretending to be smaller than I was? The answer, when it came to me, was so obvious I almost laughed out loud. I had hidden my success because I had been trained from birth to believe that my father's comfort was more important than my growth. I had been conditioned to think that his approval was the ultimate measure of my worth, and anything that threatened his position as the family's military authority figure was inherently dangerous to my security and belonging. But when had that conditioning started? When had I first learned that my dreams were less important than his ego? I remembered being 8 years old, winning the school spelling bee, and rushing home to tell him about my victory. Instead of celebration, he'd immediately launched into a story about his own academic achievements at my age, managing to spend 20 minutes talking about himself before asking a single question about my experience. I'd learned that day that my accomplishments were only valuable insofar as they reflected well on him or gave him opportunities to talk about his own superiority. I remembered being 12 and expressing interest in joining the junior ROTC program at school. He'd laughed and suggested I try cheerleading instead, something more appropriate for a young lady. When I pressed the issue, he'd gotten that look on his face, the one that meant I was pushing too hard, asking for too much, stepping out of line. I'd learned that day that there were acceptable dreams for daughters of military officers, and military service was not one of them. I remembered being 16 and trying to discuss my career goals during a family dinner with his colleagues. Every time I spoke, he'd interrupt with some gentle correction or redirection, steering the conversation toward safer topics, like my grades in English literature or my volunteer work at the local animal shelter. I'd learned that day that my voice was only welcome when it said things that reinforced his vision of who I should be. 24 years of small moments, tiny corrections, gentle redirections, and not so subtle disapprovals had created a daughter who was terrified of her own ambition, who apologized for taking up space, who spent more energy managing other people's emotions than pursuing her own goals. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. When exactly had I stopped believing that his approval was worth more than my self-respect? Maybe it was during my first weekend at Fort Meridian, when my commanding officer had looked me in the eye and said, "Ashworth, you have the instincts of a natural leader. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Maybe it was after my first promotion, when I realized that in an environment where performance was the only thing that mattered, I didn't just survive, I thrived. Or maybe it was more recent. Maybe it was 3 weeks ago when I'd received that deployment letter and realized that for the first time in my life, someone was offering me an opportunity based on my proven capabilities rather than asking me to prove I deserved consideration.
Whatever the turning point had been, sitting in that sculpture garden 15 minutes before my graduation ceremony, I finally understood something that should have been obvious years earlier. I had been sacrificing my authentic self to maintain a relationship with someone who didn't actually want to know my authentic self. For 6 years, I had been building a life that reflected my true values, my genuine passions, my natural talents. For 6 years, I had been discovering what I was capable of when I wasn't constantly second-guessing myself or managing someone else's insecurities. For 6 years, I had been becoming the person I was always meant to be. And for 6 years, I had been hiding that person from my family because I was afraid they wouldn't love her. But what if they didn't love her? What if the real me, the confident, accomplished, ambitious woman who wore eagles on her collar and commanded respect from her peers, was too threatening to my father's sense of himself? What if my success in his chosen field made him feel diminished rather than proud? Was it my responsibility to make myself smaller to protect his ego? Was it my job to minimize my achievements to maintain his comfort? Was it my obligation to live a diminished life so that he could feel like the undisputed authority figure in our family? For 24 years, I would have answered yes to all of those questions without hesitation. But sitting there in the garden, surrounded by memorials to people who had died serving something larger than themselves, looking at photos of myself serving something larger than my father's expectations, I found myself thinking about what I owed to the woman I had become during those 6 years of secret military service. I owed her honesty. I owed her recognition. I owed her the chance to stand up and be counted, to speak her truth without apology, to take credit for what she had accomplished through her own dedication and sacrifice. I owed her the chance to stop hiding. My phone buzzed with another text from Mom. "Your father is very upset. Please reconsider what you're planning to say today." For the first time in my adult life, I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I stood up from that bench, walked toward the auditorium, and thought about what I wanted to say to 3,000 people about dreams and courage and the difference between who we are and who others think we should be. I thought about the 21-year-old woman who had walked into Fort Meridian 6 years ago, terrified that she wasn't good enough, convinced that her father might be right about her limitations. I thought about the colonel who would walk across that stage in 10 minutes, carrying 6 years of proven leadership, unquestionable competence, and hard-earned self-respect. And I thought about what I owed to both of those women, the scared girl who had dared to dream beyond her father's expectations, and the accomplished officer who had made those dreams a reality. I owed them both the truth. I made it to the backstage area with exactly 7 minutes to spare, but instead of the frantic rush I should have been feeling, I found myself moving with the calm precision that military training had instilled in me. My hands were steady as I checked my appearance one final time in the small mirror mounted near the stage entrance. The woman looking back at me was someone I barely recognized, not because she looked different, but because she looked completely, authentically herself for the first time in 24 years. The undergraduate coordinator, Mrs. Patterson, appeared at my elbow with a clipboard and a stressed expression. "Jasmine, there you are. Dean Morrison has been looking for you. Your parents seemed concerned about something, and your father mentioned you might need to make some last-minute changes to your speech." Even now, even minutes before I was scheduled to address 3,000 people, Dad was working behind the scenes to control the narrative, to manage the situation, to ensure that nothing I said would challenge his version of who I was supposed to be. The old Jasmine would have immediately asked what changes he suggested. She would have spent these precious final minutes frantically editing her remarks, finding ways to minimize herself, searching for language that wouldn't threaten anyone's comfort or challenge anyone's assumptions. Instead, I looked Mrs. Patterson directly in the eyes and said, "There won't be any changes to my speech." She blinked, clearly caught off guard by my certainty. "Oh, well, if you're sure, your father seemed quite insistent." "My father doesn't speak for me. Not today." Mrs. Patterson nodded awkwardly and hurried away to deal with whatever crisis was demanding her attention next, leaving me alone with the sound system technician who was making final adjustments to my wireless microphone. "First time giving a big speech?" he asked conversationally as he clipped the battery pack to my gown. "First time giving a speech as myself," I replied, then realized how odd that must have sounded. But he just smiled. "Those are always the best kind. Good luck out there, Colonel." I froze. "Excuse me?" He gestured toward my collar where a small portion of my uniform was visible beneath my graduation gown. "Army Reserve, right? My son's a captain in the Marines. I can spot military bearing from a mile away. Your family must be proud."
For a moment, I couldn't speak. Here was a complete stranger, someone who knew nothing about my family dynamics or my father's expectations, And his first instinct upon seeing my uniform was pride. Not concern, not questions about appropriateness, not worry about whether I was overstepping some invisible boundary. Just straightforward recognition and respect for my service. "Thank you," I managed. "Thank you," he replied seriously, "both for your service and for whatever you're about to say out there. Something tells me it's gonna be important." As he walked away, I realized I was standing straighter than I had all day. Something about that brief exchange, that simple acknowledgement from someone who understood what the uniform represented, had settled something inside me that I hadn't even realized was unsettled. I pulled my phone out one final time and did something I had never done before a major family event. I turned off all notifications. Not silent mode, not do not disturb, completely off. For the next hour, my father would have no way to reach me, no way to send last-minute instructions or threats or guilt trips designed to pull me back into line. For the next hour, the only voice that mattered was my own. Standing there in the wings, I could see the audience filling the auditorium through a gap in the curtains. 3,000 people, just as Dad had said. Faculty members in their academic regalia, families in their best clothes, graduates in caps and gowns identical to mine. In the third row, I spotted my family. Dad rigid in his dress uniform, Mom perfectly composed beside him, Cameron slumped in his seat looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. 6 years ago, the sight of Dad's disapproving expression would have sent me into immediate damage control mode. I would have spent these final moments crafting mental apologies, rehearsing ways to downplay whatever I was about to say, preparing to minimize my own moment in order to restore his comfort with the situation. But today, looking at him through that gap in the curtains, I felt something I had never felt before during a family conflict. Complete emotional detachment. Not anger, not fear, not desperate love seeking validation, just nothing. He was a man in a uniform sitting in an auditorium, and his opinion of my speech was no more or less important than the opinion of any other person in that crowd. When had that happened? When had his approval stopped being the most important thing in my world? Maybe it had been gradual, built over 6 years of proving myself to people who had no reason to care about his opinion of me. Maybe it had been sudden, crystallizing the moment he called my military service alleged. Maybe it didn't matter when it had happened, only that it had happened. Dean Morrison appeared beside me, checking his own notes for the introduction he would give before my speech. "Nervous?" he asked kindly. "Actually, no," I said, and realized it was completely true. I'm excited. "Good. You should be. Your academic record is remarkable, but what you've accomplished outside the classroom is truly extraordinary. I have to admit, when your military liaison contacted us last month to verify your service record for the background check, I was amazed. A full colonel at 24, that's almost unprecedented. My military liaison had contacted them? For a background check? That could only mean one thing. The deployment orders I'd been offered weren't just a routine assignment. They were for a position significant enough to require verification of my civilian achievements as well as my military record. "Background check?" I asked. Dean Morrison looked surprised. "For your new assignment, of course. I probably shouldn't have mentioned it, but I assumed you knew that it contacted us. The Pentagon usually doesn't run civilian background checks unless it's for something quite important." The Pentagon. Not just my unit commander, not just the regional authority, the Pentagon had been investigating my background for a position I hadn't even officially accepted yet. Standing there in the wings of that auditorium with my father's disapproval radiating from the audience and my own speech about authenticity and courage waiting to be delivered, I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't just choosing between his approval and my self-respect. I was choosing between his small vision of who I should be and an opportunity that was larger than anything either of us had imagined. Mrs. Patterson reappeared with her clipboard. 2 minutes, Jasmine. Dean Morrison goes on first for your introduction, then you're up. I nodded, smoothing my gown one final time and checking that my uniform was properly arranged beneath it.
In 2 minutes, I would walk across that stage and speak my truth to 3,000 people. In 2 minutes, I would stop hiding who I had become. In 2 minutes, I would choose my authentic self over someone else's comfort. But first, I did something that 6 years ago would have been unthinkable. I took out the deployment orders that had been sitting in my purse since I'd picked them up from my commanding officer 3 days ago. Orders I had been too scared to open, too overwhelmed by the implications to seriously consider. Standing there in the wings of that auditorium, with the sound of 3,000 conversations filling the auditorium and my family waiting in the third row, I broke the seal and read the assignment I was being offered.
Strategic Planning Liaison, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Pentagon Assignment. Immediate deployment. Duration, 3 years minimum. They weren't just offering me a job. They were offering me the chance to help shape military policy at the highest levels of government. They were offering me the opportunity to serve my country in ways I had never dared to dream possible. And they were offering it to me not despite my youth, not in spite of my unconventional path to this point, but because of my proven track record of excellence, leadership, and strategic thinking. I folded the orders carefully and slipped them back into my purse. Then I walked toward the stage entrance, where Dean Morrison was already being introduced to the audience. For 24 years, I had been making choices designed to maintain other people's comfort with who I was. For the next hour, starting with this speech and continuing with whatever came after, I was going to start making choices designed to honor who I had become. As Dean Morrison began reading my introduction to the audience, I heard him mention my academic achievements, my community service, my leadership roles on campus. Standard valedictorian biography material. But what he said next made my heart skip a beat. What many of you may not know is that Jasmine has also distinguished herself through 6 years of exemplary service in the United States Army Reserve, rising to the rank of full colonel while maintaining her academic excellence here at Ravencroft. The auditorium went completely silent. 3,000 people processing information they hadn't expected to hear. Through the gap in the curtains, I watched my father's face cycle through shock, confusion, and something that looked almost like panic. This wasn't how he had planned for this moment to go. But for the first time in my life, his plans were no longer my priority. Dean Morrison continued. Please join me in welcoming our valedictorian, Colonel Jasmine Ashworth. The applause that erupted was unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't just polite academic appreciation, it was genuine surprise and admiration and respect. I walked onto that stage not as the daughter who had spent 24 years seeking her father's approval, but as the colonel who had earned her rank through 6 years of dedicated service. And for the first time in my life, that felt like exactly who I was supposed to be. Walking across that stage toward the podium, with 3,000 pairs of eyes watching my every step and the weight of my hidden uniform beneath my graduation gown, I felt something I had never experienced during a public speaking engagement. Complete alignment between who I was and who I was presenting myself to be. The applause continued as I approached the microphone, but I could see pockets of confusion throughout the audience. Parents leaning toward each other, whispering questions about what they'd just heard. Faculty members checking their programs, apparently surprised by the military information that hadn't been included in the printed materials. And in the third row, my family sitting in stunned silence. Dad's face had gone completely pale. Mom was gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. Even Cameron had looked up from his phone, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I reached the podium and looked out at the sea of faces, taking a moment to let the applause die down naturally.
In that brief silence, I made a decision that would have been impossible for the woman I'd been even 6 months ago. I was going to tell them everything. Thank you, Dean Morrison, for that introduction, and thank you to the faculty, families, and fellow graduates gathered here today. When I began writing this speech 6 weeks ago, I thought I would be talking about gratitude, perseverance, and the bright future awaiting the class of 2024. I thought I would offer some carefully crafted wisdom about following your dreams and staying true to your values. But standing here today, looking out at all of you, I realize that the most valuable thing I can share isn't wisdom about following dreams. It's truth about what happens when you have the courage to follow them, even when the people closest to you believe those dreams are impossible, inappropriate, or inconvenient. A murmur ran through the audience. This clearly wasn't going to be a typical valedictorian address about bright futures and limitless possibilities. 6 years ago, when I was 18 years old, I applied to the Army Reserve Officer Candidate School. I didn't tell my family about it because I knew they would try to stop me. I didn't announce it to my friends because I wasn't sure I was brave enough to go through with it. I didn't even tell my academic advisor because I was terrified that someone would convince me I was making a mistake. Through the crowd, I could see people starting to sit up straighter, lean forward, pay attention in a way that went beyond polite academic ceremony audience behavior. This was becoming something else entirely.
I was accepted into the program, and every weekend for the past 6 years, while you thought I was studying in the library or hanging out with friends, I was actually 3 hours away at Fort Meridian, learning how to lead soldiers, design training programs, and serve my country. Every summer internship I mentioned was actually military leadership school, advanced strategic planning courses, or assignments that would prepare me for greater responsibility. I could see Dad's face clearly now. The hope had disappeared entirely, replaced by something approaching panic. He was realizing that this wasn't a moment of rebellion that could be managed or controlled. This was a complete revelation of a life he'd known nothing about. I kept the secret for 6 years because I was afraid. Not afraid of military service. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I was afraid of disappointing people whose approval I thought I needed more than I needed my own self-respect. I was afraid of challenging assumptions about who I was supposed to be and what I was supposed to want. A woman in the 4th row was wiping her eyes with a tissue. Several graduates in the front section were nodding, apparently recognizing something familiar in what I was describing. But here's what I learned during those 6 years of living 2 separate lives. When you deny your authentic self to maintain other people's comfort, you don't just rob yourself of the opportunity to become who you're meant to be. You rob everyone around you of the opportunity to know and love the real you. I pulled the deployment orders from my purse and held them up, the official Pentagon letterhead visible even from a distance. 3 days ago, I received orders for a position I never dreamed I'd be qualified for. The Pentagon is offering me the opportunity to serve as strategic planning liaison to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's a 3-year assignment that would put me at the center of military policy development at the highest levels of our government. It's the kind of opportunity that comes along once in a career, if you're lucky enough and good enough and in the right place at the right time. The auditorium was completely silent now. Even the usual rustling of programs and shifting in seats had stopped. But here accepting this position would mean leaving everything familiar behind. It would mean moving across the country, taking on responsibilities that would challenge me in ways I can't even imagine yet, and stepping fully into an identity that some people in my life have never been comfortable with. I looked directly at my father as I said those words, and I saw him flinch slightly. For 6 years, I've been trying to live in both worlds. The world where I was a dutiful daughter who never challenged anyone's expectations, and the world where I was a military officer who had proven herself capable of extraordinary things. For 6 years, I convinced myself that this balance was sustainable, that I could honor both parts of myself without anyone getting hurt.
But I was wrong. The only person getting hurt was me. And more importantly, by hiding who I really am, I was preventing myself from becoming who I'm truly capable of being. I held up the deployment orders again. So, here's what I'm going to do. In front of all of you, in front of my family, in front of my professors and classmates, and everyone who has watched me pretend to be smaller than I am for the past 4 years, I'm going to stop pretending. The auditorium was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat in the wireless microphone. I'm accepting this assignment. I'm moving to Washington, D.C. I'm taking on a job that terrifies and excites me in equal measure. I'm choosing to build my life around my authentic self rather than other people's comfortable assumptions about who I should be. Through the crowd, I could see people starting to smile, starting to sit back in their seats with expressions of admiration and surprise. But in the third row, my family looked like they'd been struck by lightning. Class of 2024, I challenge you to ask yourself this question. What would you do if you knew that the people who love you would support you no matter what? What dreams would you pursue if you weren't afraid of disappointing someone? What version of yourself would you become if you stopped trying to manage everyone else's comfort with your choices? I folded the deployment orders carefully and slipped them back into my purse. Don't wait 6 years to find out. Don't spend the best years of your life hiding who you really are because you're afraid of how other people will react to your authenticity. Take the job that scares you. Move to the city that calls to you. Pursue the dreams that make other people nervous. I looked out at the graduating class, at hundreds of young people who were about to make their own choices about how much of themselves they were willing to reveal to the world. Because here's what I learned the hard way. The people who truly love you will find a way to celebrate your success even when it surprises them. And the people who can't celebrate your authentic self, well, maybe their comfort isn't worth more than your growth.
I stepped back from the podium as the applause began, but this time it was different. This wasn't polite academic appreciation. This was genuine enthusiasm, surprise, and respect from 3,000 people who had just witnessed someone choose courage over comfort in real time. As I walked back across the stage, I caught sight of my family in the third row one more time. Dad was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shock, definitely, but something else too. Maybe recognition? Maybe fear? Maybe, for the first time in 24 years, genuine uncertainty about who his daughter actually was. But for the first time in my life, his reaction wasn't my primary concern. I had just chosen myself, publicly and irrevocably, in front of everyone who mattered to me. And it felt like the first real breath I'd taken in years. The aftermath of my graduation speech was unlike anything I could have anticipated. As I walked off the stage and back to my seat among the graduating class, the energy in the auditorium had completely transformed. What had started as a polite academic ceremony had become something electric, unpredictable, alive with possibility. The student sitting next to me, a pre-med major named Derek, whom I'd barely spoken to in 4 years, leaned over and whispered, "That was the most incredible thing I've ever heard. I had no idea you were in the military." 3 seats down, a woman I recognized from my international relations seminars was wiping tears from her eyes. Across the aisle, 2 graduates were having an animated whispered conversation, one of them pointing at something on her phone screen. But it wasn't just the students who were reacting. As Dean Morrison returned to the podium to continue with the degree conferral ceremony, I could see faculty members throughout the auditorium leaning toward each other, talking in low voices. Some were nodding approvingly, others looked genuinely surprised, and a few seemed to be checking their own phones, probably looking up information about military service requirements or Pentagon assignments. The ceremony continued with the traditional calling of names and crossing of the stage, but the atmosphere remained charged with something that hadn't been there before my speech. When my name was called and I walked across to receive my diploma, the applause was noticeably louder and longer than it had been for other graduates. Several faculty members shook my hand with what felt like genuine respect rather than ceremonial politeness. Professor Martinez, who had been my thesis advisor for my senior project on military strategy and asymmetric warfare, held onto my hand an extra moment after presenting my diploma. I should have known. Your understanding of military operations was always too sophisticated to be purely academic. Congratulations, Colonel. It was the first time anyone had addressed me by my military rank in a civilian academic setting, and the way it sounded, natural, earned, appropriate, made something settle into place that I hadn't even realized was unsettled. But for the first time in my life, post-event family gatherings had followed a predictable pattern. Dad would hold court, receiving congratulations and attention while I stood quietly nearby, trying to read his mood, preparing to apologize for anything that might have displeased him, working to restore whatever equilibrium my presence or actions might have disrupted. This time was different. This time, people weren't approaching our family group to congratulate my father on his daughter's achievements. They were approaching me directly, asking questions about my military service, expressing genuine curiosity about the Pentagon assignment, sharing their own stories of family members in the military or their own experiences with choosing difficult paths despite opposition. Mrs. Henderson, whose daughter had been in my high school class, pulled me aside near the refreshment table. "Jasmine, I have to tell you, what you said up there really affected me. My youngest daughter wants to be an engineer, but her father keeps telling her it's not practical for women. After hearing your speech, I think I need to have a conversation with him about supporting her dreams instead of limiting them." Dr. Carlisle, one of my economics professors, approached me with his wife and teenage son. "Colonel Ashworth, I wanted to introduce you to my son Marcus. He's been talking about military service, but we've been encouraging him to focus on college first. After hearing about your experience, I'm wondering if we've been thinking about this all wrong. Could you tell him about how you balanced academic and military commitments?" For 30 minutes, I found myself surrounded by genuinely interested people, asking thoughtful questions, sharing personal stories, treating me as an expert on something I had spent 6 years hiding from everyone in my civilian life. The contrast with every other family event I could remember was stark. Instead of deflecting attention, minimizing my achievements, or managing other people's comfort with my presence, I was simply being myself and discovering that myself was someone people actually wanted to know. My phone, which I had turned back on after the ceremony, was buzzing constantly with text messages. Classmates I hadn't heard from in years were reaching out with congratulations. High school friends were sending messages saying they finally understood why I had always seemed like I was holding something back. Even professors from previous semesters were emailing to express their admiration and ask if I had time to talk with other students who might be interested in military service.
The most surprising message came from Captain Rodriguez, who had been my first commanding officer at Fort Meridian 6 years ago. "Colonel, just saw video of your graduation speech online. 6 years ago, you were a scared 21-year-old who wasn't sure she belonged in uniform. Today, you're inspiring thousands of people to choose courage over comfort. Outstanding leadership, as always. The Army is lucky to have you." My speech was already online? I hadn't even considered that someone might have been recording the ceremony for social media or news coverage. As the reception began to wind down, I noticed something that would have been unimaginable at any previous family event. I wasn't keeping track of my father's location, monitoring his facial expressions, or strategizing about how to manage his reaction to the day's events. For the first time in my adult life, his emotional state wasn't my responsibility. That freedom was intoxicating. Jasmine, Dr. Patterson, the undergraduate coordinator who had been so stressed about my speech earlier, appeared at my elbow with a clipboard and a much more relaxed expression than she'd had backstage. "I wanted to let you know we've already gotten calls from 3 different news outlets asking for interviews about your story. The local NBC affiliate wants to do a feature on military families and hidden service, and someone from Military Times magazine called asking if you'd be willing to write an opinion piece about balancing military and civilian identities." News interviews? Opinion pieces?
6 hours ago, I had been a secret colonel desperately trying to hide her authentic self from her own family. Now I was being invited to share my story with the broader world. I'll need to check with my public affairs officer about media appearances, I heard myself saying, but I'm definitely interested. As Dr. Patterson walked away, I realized what had just happened. I had automatically responded as a military officer first, considering protocol and proper channels, rather than as a daughter seeking permission or approval from family authority figures. The shift felt seismic. My roommate Natasha appeared with 2 cups of punch and a grin that could have powered the entire campus. "So, Colonel," she said, emphasizing my rank in the teasing way that told me our friendship hadn't changed, even though everything else had, "when exactly were you planning to tell your roommate about the Pentagon assignment? Because I'm pretty sure I deserve advance notice before my best friend moves to Washington to help run the military." "I only decided to accept it about 2 hours ago," I admitted. "During your speech?" "During my speech." She laughed and shook her head. "Only you would make a life-changing career decision in front of 3,000 people. But honestly, Jazz, watching you up there, you looked like yourself for the first time since I've known you. Like you finally stopped apologizing for taking up space." As the sun began to set over the campus quad and families started gathering their things to leave, I found myself standing alone for a moment, looking out at the scene of my transformation. Students and faculty were still clustered in small groups, many of them still talking animatedly about the speech or about their own dreams and challenges. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from a number I didn't recognize. "Colonel Ashworth, this is Lieutenant General Patricia Hayes, Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategy. I was at a conference where someone showed me video of your graduation speech. Would you be available for a phone call next week to discuss your new assignment? I think we have some additional opportunities you might be interested in." Additional opportunities from a 3-star general, based on a speech I had given 2 hours ago. Standing there in the fading light, surrounded by the debris of a graduation reception and the energy of a day that had changed everything, I realized that for the first time in my life, I had no idea what came next. And that uncertainty felt like the most exciting thing that had ever happened to me. For 24 years, I had known exactly what was expected of me, exactly how to behave to maintain everyone else's comfort, exactly how small I needed to make myself to avoid challenging anyone's assumptions. Now, I was walking into a future where my authentic self was not just accepted, but actively sought after, where my achievements opened doors instead of creating problems, where being exactly who I meant to be was not just acceptable, but valuable. I had spent 6 years building a secret identity that was more real than the public persona I'd been maintaining. Tonight, for the first time, they were the same person. 3 days after graduation, I was in my childhood bedroom packing my military dress uniforms when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my Aunt Patricia's number, Dad's older sister, whom I hadn't heard from in over a year. In our family, Aunt Patricia only called when she'd been recruited as an intermediary for situations that required delicate handling. "Jasmine, sweetheart, I just wanted to call and congratulate you on your graduation. Your father mentioned it was quite an eventful ceremony." Quite an eventful. That was certainly one way to describe publicly revealing 6 years of secret military service and accepting a Pentagon assignment in front of 3,000 people while your father watched in horror from the 3rd row. "Thank you, Aunt Patricia. It was definitely memorable. Now, honey, I hope you won't mind me saying this, but your father seems quite concerned about some of the decisions you're making. He mentioned something about Washington, D.C.
And there it was. Dad had called in reinforcements, dispatching his sister to do what he apparently couldn't. Convince me to reconsider the Pentagon assignment, to find some way to walk back the public declarations I'd made, to restore the comfortable family dynamic where my choices were subject to his approval. "I've been offered a position with the Joint Chiefs of Staff," I said, continuing to fold my dress blues into the garment bag. "It's an incredible opportunity." "Oh, I'm sure it is, dear.
But Washington is so far from home, and you're still so young. Don't you think it might be wise to stay closer to family while you're starting your career? Maybe find something local where your father could provide guidance and support." The old Jasmine would have immediately begun second-guessing herself. She would have started listing all the reasons why maybe Aunt Patricia was right, why maybe the Pentagon assignment was too ambitious, too risky, too far from the safety of family oversight. But as I listened to her carefully crafted concerns, all I could think about was the email I'd received that morning from Lieutenant General Hayes's aide, confirming our phone call for tomorrow and mentioning that the general was specifically interested in my background in strategic planning and my unique perspective on military-civilian integration. "Aunt Patricia," I said calmly, "I appreciate your concern. But I'm 24 years old, and I've been successfully managing my military career for 6 years without family guidance. I think I can handle Washington." A pause. I could practically hear her recalibrating, trying to find a different angle of approach. "Well, of course you're capable, dear. No one's questioning that. But family is so important, especially for young women starting out in demanding careers. Your mother is worried sick about you being so far away, with no family support system." Mom was worried sick. Interesting, since Mom hadn't said a word to me directly since the graduation ceremony. She'd spent the entire reception standing silently beside Dad, avoiding eye contact whenever I approached their general vicinity. Has Mom mentioned being worried? Or is Dad worried and projecting that onto her? Another pause, longer this time. "Jasmine, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. Your parents just want what's best for you." "And what exactly do they think is best for me?" "Well, perhaps something closer to home. Maybe you could find a nice position with the National Guard unit here in state. Something that would let you use your military training, but keep you near family. Your father knows several people who could—" "Aunt Patricia," I interrupted, "let me ask you something. When you were 24 years old, if someone had offered you the opportunity of a lifetime, would you have turned it down because your family was worried about you living too far away?" "That's different, dear. I wasn't in such a visible position. Military careers can be so unpredictable, especially for women. And Washington politics can be quite brutal." There it was. The real concern wasn't geographic distance or family support systems. The issue was that I was succeeding too visibly, too independently, in a world that Dad had always claimed as his own territory. "Has Dad asked you to convince me not to take the Pentagon assignment?" "Your father is just concerned." "That's not what I asked." The silence stretched long enough that I had my answer. "Aunt Patricia, I love our family, but I'm not going to turn down the opportunity to serve my country at the highest levels because it makes some people uncomfortable. This assignment isn't about rebellion or independence or trying to prove anything to anyone. It's about using the skills I've developed to serve something larger than myself." "But surely you can understand why your parents would be concerned about you making such major decisions without consulting them first." And there was the heart of the matter. Not concern for my well-being, not worry about my capabilities, not even anxiety about the distance or the demands of the position. The issue was that I had made a major life decision without seeking permission, without going through proper channels, without acknowledging their authority over my choices. "Aunt Patricia, I consulted with my commanding officers, my mentors, my academic advisors, and my own carefully considered judgment. I'm not required to get my parents' permission to accept a military assignment." "Of course not, legally speaking, but from a family perspective." "From a family perspective, I would hope they'd be proud that their daughter has earned an assignment that most officers wait their entire careers for if they're lucky enough to be considered at all." I could hear her taking a deep breath, preparing for what was probably her final attempt at persuasion. Jasmine, honey, I'm going to be very direct with you. Your father has worked very hard to build his reputation in military circles in the state. He's concerned that your high-profile approach might reflect poorly on the family name. Some of his colleagues are asking questions about how you managed to achieve such rapid promotions without anyone knowing about your service. There are whispers about whether proper protocols were followed. My hands stopped moving as I processed what she'd just said. Dad wasn't just concerned about my independence or my geographic distance from family oversight. He was concerned that my success was making him look bad professionally. He was worried that my achievements were somehow diminishing his own reputation.
Are you saying that Dad's colleagues are questioning the legitimacy of my military service? I'm saying that when someone achieves such rapid advancement in secret, people naturally wonder how that was possible. Your father is fielding some uncomfortable questions about his knowledge of your activities. The audacity was breathtaking. 6 years of dedicated service, exemplary performance reviews, rapid but well-documented promotions based on merit and achievement, and somehow the story Dad was getting from his colleagues was that my success was suspicious, questionable, possibly inappropriate. Aunt Patricia, my service record is completely transparent and available for review by anyone with proper security clearance. Every promotion was earned, documented, and approved through standard military channels. If Dad's colleagues have questions about military advancement procedures, they're welcome to consult with the appropriate authorities. That's not the point, dear. Then what is the point? The point is that this situation has created problems for your father that could have been avoided if you had simply discussed your plans with the family before making such dramatic announcements. There it was, the final card. I wasn't being asked to reconsider the Pentagon assignment for my own good, or for my safety, or because anyone genuinely believed I wasn't capable of handling it. I was being asked to sacrifice the opportunity of a lifetime because my success was creating social discomfort for my father. Aunt Patricia, I need to ask you something, and I'd like you to think carefully before you answer. If I were Dad's son instead of his daughter, and I had secretly earned rapid military promotions and been offered a Pentagon assignment, do you think he would be calling it problematic? Do you think he'd be worried about family consultation and proper protocols? Or do you think he'd be bragging to his colleagues about such an accomplished military officer? The silence that followed was so long, I thought the call might have dropped. That's not fair, she said finally. Isn't it? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like the problem isn't that I succeeded without permission. The problem is that I succeeded beyond his expectations, in his field, without his control. And now he's trying to use family loyalty to pull me back into a smaller version of myself. Jasmine, I think you're being very harsh. Your father loves you. I know he does, but I'm starting to understand that his love has always come with conditions, and one of those conditions is that I not succeed in ways that make him uncomfortable. I finished folding my dress uniforms and zipped the garment bag closed. Aunt Patricia, please tell Dad that I appreciate his concern, but I'm accepting the Pentagon assignment. I'll be moving to Washington next month, and if his colleagues have questions about my service record, I'm happy to provide references from my commanding officers. Jasmine, and please tell him that I hope someday he'll be proud of what I've accomplished instead of worried about how it reflects on him. After I hung up, I sat on my childhood bed surrounded by boxes of belongings I was preparing to ship to Washington when Dad showed up at my apartment unannounced. I heard his distinctive knock, 3 sharp raps followed by 2 softer ones, a pattern he'd used since I was a child, and immediately felt that old familiar tightness in my chest trying to reassert itself. But this time, the anxiety lasted only a moment before being replaced by something I'd never felt during one of his surprise visits. mild curiosity about what he thought this conversation was going to accomplish. I opened the door to find him standing in the hallway in his dress uniform, which was unusual for a Tuesday afternoon. Dad only wore his dress uniform for official ceremonies, formal military events, or when he wanted to remind someone of his rank and authority. Apparently, this qualified as the latter. "Dad," I said, stepping aside to let him in, "I wasn't expecting you." "We need to talk," he said, his tone carrying all the weight of paternal authority he'd wielded throughout my childhood. "This Washington situation." The Washington situation, not my assignment, not my achievement, not my opportunity to serve at the highest levels of military command, my situation. "What about it?" I asked, genuinely curious about what approach he was planning to take. The family intermediary strategy hadn't worked, the professional reputation concerns hadn't swayed me. What was left in his arsenal of control tactics? He walked into my living room and surveyed the packed boxes, the furniture covered with sheets, the general chaos of someone preparing for a major move. His expression was unreadable, but I could sense him taking inventory, probably calculating how much of this process was already irreversible. "Jasmine, I've been thinking about our conversation after graduation, and I believe there may have been some misunderstandings."
Misunderstandings. That was an interesting way to frame a conversation where he'd called my military service alleged and threatened to cut off all family support if I didn't minimize my achievements to protect his comfort. "What kind of misunderstandings?" I asked, settling into the one chair I hadn't yet packed and gesturing for him to sit on the couch. He remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in the formal military posture I recognized as his preparation for delivering important pronouncements. "I think you may have interpreted my concerns as disapproval of your military service. That wasn't my intention. I've always been proud of your dedication and your accomplishments." The slight pause before accomplishments told me everything I needed to know about how genuine the statement was. But I was curious to see where he was going with this new approach. "I appreciate that," I said neutrally. "What I'm concerned about is the speed at which you're making these major life changes. This Pentagon assignment, it's a tremendous opportunity, but it's also a tremendous responsibility. Are you certain you're ready for that level of visibility?" Visibility. There was that word again. The same concern Aunt Patricia had raised, the same worry that had motivated his threats after graduation. Not whether I was capable, not whether I deserved the opportunity, but whether my success would create problems for him. I've been preparing for increased responsibility my entire military career. Every promotion, every assignment, every leadership role has been building toward exactly this kind of opportunity. Of course, but the Pentagon is different. The political pressures, the scrutiny, the potential for one mistake to destroy an entire career. It's not like anything you've experienced before. He was right about that. But what he didn't seem to understand was that his concern wasn't motivating me to reconsider the assignment. It was helping me understand just how little faith he had in my abilities. "Dad, are you asking me to turn down the assignment?" "I'm asking you to consider whether accepting it is the wisest course of action at this stage of your career." "And what would be the wisest course of action?" He began pacing, a sure sign that he was building toward his primary argument. "There are other opportunities, Jasmine, opportunities that would allow you to gain experience gradually with proper mentorship and guidance. Colonel Henderson in the State National Guard has mentioned that they could use someone with your strategic planning background. You'd still be serving your country, but in an environment where you could develop your skills without the intense pressure of Washington politics." Colonel Henderson, Dad's golf partner and longtime friend, whose idea of strategic planning probably involved organizing the annual military ball. He was offering me a chance to serve in his friends unit, under his indirect oversight,
in a position where my success or failure would reflect directly on his judgment and reputation. So instead of the Pentagon assignment, you'd prefer I take a position where you could provide guidance and oversight. I'd prefer you take a position where you could succeed without unnecessary risks to your career or your reputation. And what risks are you worried about specifically? He stopped pacing and looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. Jasmine, you're 24 years old. You've achieved rapid promotions in what was essentially a part-time military role while focusing on your education. The people at the Pentagon are career officers with decades of full-time military experience. Do you really think you're prepared to compete at that level? There was the core of his concern, finally stated explicitly. He didn't think I was good enough. 6 years of exemplary service, rapid promotions based on merit, selection for one of the most competitive assignments in the military, and he still saw me as the uncertain 18-year-old who needed his protection from her own unrealistic dreams. Dad, the Pentagon didn't offer me this assignment because they felt sorry for me or because they wanted to give a young officer a chance to learn. They offered it because my performance record demonstrates that I'm already competing at that level successfully. Performance and training exercises and weekend responsibilities isn't the same as full-time military service under real pressure. You're right, it's not the same. In many ways, it's more challenging. I've been managing dual responsibilities, proving myself in both military and civilian contexts simultaneously, adapting to different command structures and expectations every weekend for 6 years. That kind of flexibility and resilience is exactly what they're looking for in Washington. His expression shifted, and I could see him recalibrating again. The direct challenge to my qualifications hadn't worked either. Even if you're prepared for the professional demands, he said, are you prepared for the personal costs? Washington assignments are notorious for destroying family relationships, for isolating officers from their support systems. You'd be living alone in a new city, working 80 hours a week, surrounded by people who see you as competition rather than colleagues. And there was his final card. Fear. Fear of isolation, fear of failure, fear of being alone without family support in a demanding environment. 6 months ago, that argument might have been effective. The old Jasmine had been terrified of disappointing people, terrified of being alone, terrified of taking risks that might end in visible failure. But the woman sitting in this apartment, surrounded by boxes ready for shipment to Washington, wasn't afraid of those things anymore.
"Dad," I said, and something in my voice must have signaled a shift because he stopped talking immediately. "I need to ask you something, and I'd like you to think carefully before you answer." He nodded warily. "Are you trying to protect me from making a mistake, or are you trying to protect yourself from having a daughter who succeeds beyond your ability to control or guide her success?" The silence that followed was unlike any silence we'd ever shared. I could see him processing the question, probably recognizing that there was no good answer that wouldn't reveal the truth about his motivations. "That's not a fair question," he said finally. "Isn't it? Because from where I'm sitting, every concern you've raised has been about managing risks to reputation, avoiding visibility, staying within safe parameters where family oversight is possible. Not one of your arguments has been about whether I'm capable of doing the job well." "Of course I think you're capable." "Do you? Because you've spent the last 30 minutes explaining why I'm not ready for this level of responsibility, why I should choose a safer position where you can provide guidance, why I should be afraid of failure in an environment you think is beyond my current abilities." He sat down heavily on the couch, suddenly looking older than his 52 years. "Jasmine, I'm your father. It's my job to protect you from situations that could harm your career or your future. And it's my job as an adult and as a military officer to assess risks and make decisions based on my own judgment and capabilities. That's what I've been doing for 6 years, and it's what I'm going to continue doing."
I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where I'd grown up, the streets I'd walked as a child, when I still believed that his approval was the most important thing in the world. Dad, I love you, but I'm not going to turn down the opportunity of a lifetime because you're not comfortable with me succeeding in ways you can't control. When I turned back to face him, he was staring at his hands, probably realizing that none of his strategies had worked, that the daughter he'd been trying to manage and redirect for 24 years was no longer available for management or redirection. "What if you fail?" he asked quietly. "Then I'll fail, and I'll learn from it, and I'll try again, just like every other officer who's ever taken on challenging assignments. What if I'm right about the risks?" "Then you'll be right. But I'd rather fail attempting something extraordinary than succeed at something safe." He looked up at me then, and for the first time in our conversation, I saw something in his expression that might have been recognition. "You're really going to do this?" "Yes. No matter what I say, no matter what you say." He nodded slowly, and I realized that, for the first time in my adult life, we were having a conversation between equals, two military officers who happened to be related, rather than a father trying to control his child's choices. It felt like the first honest conversation we'd ever had. 6 months later, I was standing in the Pentagon briefing room, presenting a strategic assessment to a group of senior military leaders when my phone buzzed with a text that would have sent me into an emotional spiral a year earlier. Now it barely registered as a distraction worth acknowledging. The message was from Cameron. "Dad's promotion ceremony is next Friday. Mom says you should come, family appearance expectations, etc." I finished my presentation on interagency coordination protocols, answered questions from 2 different generals about implementation timelines, and scheduled follow-up meetings with the Joint Staff before I even glanced at my phone again. Family appearance expectations. As if my presence at Dad's promotion ceremony was a duty I owed rather than a choice I could make based on my own schedule and priorities. The old Jasmine would have immediately started calculating. Could she rearrange her Pentagon meetings? Would missing the ceremony damage family relationships permanently? How could she minimize the conflict while still meeting everyone's expectations? She would have spent the rest of the day anxious about disappointing someone, guilty about prioritizing her career over family obligations. But the woman who had just briefed the Joint Chiefs of Staff on strategic planning protocols felt none of that familiar anxiety. Instead, she felt something approaching amusement at the assumption that her attendance was mandatory rather than optional. I texted back, "Congratulations to Dad. I have meetings that day, but we'll try to make it work." Try to make it work. Not a desperate scrambling to accommodate everyone else's schedule, not an immediate yes despite my own professional obligations, not an apology for having priorities that might conflict with family events, just a simple acknowledgement that I had competing commitments and would see if accommodation was possible. The response came back within minutes. "Mom says it's important. Dad specifically requested that you be there." Dad specifically requested. The same man who had spent my entire adult life dismissing my achievements, questioning my capabilities, and trying to redirect my ambitions towards safer, smaller targets, was now specifically requesting my presence at his own moment of professional advancement.
The irony was not lost on me. That evening, I was in my Washington apartment, a space I decorated exactly to my own taste for the first time in my life, when my phone rang. Mom's number. "Jasmine, honey, I hope you got Cameron's message about your father's ceremony." "I did. Congratulations on Dad's promotion. That's wonderful news." "Yes, well, he's worked very hard for it. The thing is, sweetheart, he specifically asked that you attend in uniform. He'd like you to be part of the family military tradition aspect of the ceremony." I set down the strategic planning document I'd been reviewing and really considered what she was asking. Dad wanted me to attend his promotion ceremony in uniform? The same uniform he'd spent months trying to convince me to hide? The same rank he'd called alleged? The same service record he'd suggested was somehow inappropriate or suspicious?
Now that he was being promoted, suddenly my military identity was something he wanted displayed, something that added to, rather than detracted from, the family's military prestige. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course, dear. 6 months ago, Dad threatened to disown me if I mentioned my military service in my graduation speech. Now, he specifically wants me to wear my uniform to his promotion ceremony. What changed? A long pause. I could practically hear her choosing her words carefully. Your father has come to better understand your achievements. Some of his colleagues have mentioned how impressed they are with your Pentagon assignment. He's realized that your success reflects well on the family military tradition. There it was. My military service had become acceptable, even desirable, now that it enhanced his reputation rather than threatening it. My achievements were finally worthy of family recognition now that they served his interests rather than challenging his authority. Mom, I appreciate the invitation, but I need to check my schedule. Can I get back to you tomorrow? Jasmine, this is really important to your father. I understand that, but my schedule is really important to me. After I hung up, I sat in my living room looking out at the Washington skyline and marveled at how different this conversation felt from every other family obligation I'd navigated in my adult life. There was no guilt, no desperate need to please, no automatic assumption that their priorities should override my own. The next day, I checked my calendar and discovered that Friday was indeed free. I could attend the ceremony without any professional conflicts. But for the first time in my life, having the ability to accommodate a family request didn't automatically mean I would. Instead, I found myself asking a question I'd never asked before. Did I want to go? The answer was complicated. I was proud of Dad's promotion. It represented decades of dedicated service and well-earned recognition. I loved my family despite our complicated history, and part of me was curious to see how this event would unfold, whether Dad had genuinely changed his perspective on my career, or whether this was just another form of control disguised as inclusion. But another part of me was tired of family events that centered around managing his emotions, accommodating his expectations, and performing whatever version of myself he found most comfortable at any given moment. I called Lieutenant General Hayes, my Pentagon supervisor, and asked if she had a few minutes for a personal matter on advice. Colonel Ashworth, what can I help you with? Ma'am, my father is being promoted to Brigadier General next Friday, and I've been invited to attend in uniform. I'm trying to decide whether my attendance would be appropriate given my current assignment and responsibilities. There was a pause, and I could sense her processing the subtext of my question. Colonel, is this a question about professional protocol or personal boundaries? Probably both, ma'am. In that case, let me ask you this. Will attending the ceremony help you serve your country more effectively, or will it distract from your ability to focus on your current responsibilities? It was a perfectly military way of framing the question, and it clarified everything I'd been struggling to articulate. I think it might be a distraction, ma'am. Then you have your answer. Your first obligation is to your current mission. Family events are important, but they're secondary to your professional duties. I thanked her and hung up, finally clear about what I wanted to do. I called Mom back that afternoon. Hi, Mom. I've checked my schedule and I won't be able to attend Dad's ceremony on Friday. Oh, Jasmine, that's disappointing. Your father will be very upset. I'm sure he will be, but I have responsibilities here that take priority. Sweetheart, surely you can rearrange your Pentagon schedule for one day. This is your father's promotion to general. It's a once-in-a-lifetime event. Mom, I've rearranged my schedule for family events my entire adult life. This time, I'm choosing not to. The silence that followed was so long, I thought she might have hung up. I don't understand. I know you don't, but I hope someday you will. What should I tell your father? Tell him I'm proud of his promotion and I hope he enjoys his ceremony. Tell him his daughter is serving her country at the Pentagon exactly like he taught her to do.
That Friday, while Dad was being promoted to Brigadier General in a ceremony I wasn't attending, I was in a classified briefing with the Secretary of Defense, presenting analysis that would influence military policy for the next decade. My phone buzzed with several messages throughout the day. Photos from the ceremony, updates on how nice it was, pointed comments about my absence. But I didn't check them until after my briefing was complete and my professional responsibilities for the day were finished. The final message was from Dad himself, sent 3 hours after his ceremony ended. Disappointed you couldn't be there today. Hope your Pentagon work was worth missing family. I stared at that message for a long time, recognizing it as one final attempt to make me feel guilty for choosing my own priorities over his expectations. A year ago, it would have worked. A year ago, I would have been devastated by his disappointment, convinced that I'd made a terrible mistake, desperate to find some way to make it up to him. But sitting in my Pentagon office, looking out at the city where I was building the career I'd always dreamed of, I felt something I'd never felt in response to my father's disappointment. Complete peace with my decision. I typed back, "Congratulations again on your promotion, Dad. Yes, my Pentagon work was worth it." Then I turned off my phone, finished reviewing the next day's briefing materials, and went home to the life I'd built by choosing myself over other people's comfort. For the first time in 24 years, his disappointment was his problem, not mine. And that freedom felt like everything I'd been working toward my entire life.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.